Okay, this week we are going to talk about fuel injection systems. We're going to talk about two different types, the Bendix RSA and the TCM, well I still call it TCM, but they've changed hands, TCM continuous fuel flow systems. When you are looking in your reading material, make sure that you notice that there is a big difference between the RS fuel injection and the RSA. We're only going to be studying the RSA system. So if you're reading about the RS and you know about the RSA, you kind of walked it, wait a minute, this is totally different than what I thought. And you realize, oh, I'm reading the RS system, which is not the same. So we're talking about those two specific systems. Short Q&A this week. I think there's only 6 questions. So how many can you miss on the test?
One.
Can you miss one? I don't even think you missed one.
Zero. Half one?
Probably a half, yeah.
What, do you forget your name on that one? You bubble half of it in.
You can forget your name as long as nobody else does. You miss one?
You missed one.
All right, Michelle. There we go. Well, you know what? Since I've got this up, probably should have pulled this up before. So when we're talking about the cockpit and flight deck, about the various things in here, I'm aware that some of you are not familiar with the inside of an aircraft. So what is this thing right here?
Throttle.
That is our throttle. When we push it in, the airplane goes faster, all right? And when we pull it back, slower. Should be RPM. If I pull it all the way back, what happens?
Idle.
Just idle. All right. Let's scoop over the red one. What does the red one do?
Mixture.
It's called the mixture. What else can we call it? It's a manual mixture control. Or if I pull it all the way out, what happens? Idle cutoff. All right. So we've got the mixture. All the way in is throttle. All the way in is fast. Mixture. All the way in is rich. All the way back over here is idle. All the way back here is idle cutoff. All right. Anybody in here drive a tractor? All right. What's different about this?
Talking old school or new school?
How's new school?
All computerized.
Old school. It's backwards. So I've talked to flight instructors. They say the person they hate to teach the most is anybody who knows how to drive a tractor. Because when muscle memory, when you say, more throttle, first thing to do is pull back on it. So it's like, okay, that's the opposite of what we just needed. All right. We're not going to talk about the blue knob just yet, but I want you to get familiar with that. So if I have a fixed pitch propeller, I'm going to have throttle and I'm going to have mixture. If I have a constant speed propeller, I'm going to add in RPM. All right, so be thinking about RPM if we start talking about that. So if this is all, remember, all the way in is the most. And we talked about the saying balls to the wall, which came from the throttle quadrants, had little balls on them on the end, similar to what you're using when you do the test stand. When you push them all the way to the wall, it was faster. So there's little balls in there to the wall. And go faster. So everything forward is fast, fast, fast. So the most amount of fuel forward, highest RPM, highest RPM, throttle. So this becomes not the RPM, but this is throttle. All right, and throttle directly controls manifold pressure. So what happens is when you start up the aircraft, you would have mixture, full, rich, forward, prop, all the way in, high RPM. And the throttle is going to work just like you're used to on a fixed pitch. You push it forward, the RPM goes up. You pull it back, the RPM goes down. You push it forward, the RPM goes up, and the manifold pressure goes up. Pull it back, the manifold pressure goes down, the RPM goes down. But when you get it to a certain point, let's say we get it above 2,000 RPM, at some point, the RPM is going to start working. And what happens is if I push, say I push the throttle all the way in and I bring it up to, we'll say 2,500 RPM. If I reach over here and start pulling back this blue knob, it's going to add more pitch to the propeller, and it's going to start bringing the RPM down. It's kind of like you're going along in your car and you have the throttle set with your foot, and you're holding it perfectly still and you come to a hill and start going up, what happens to everything? RPM slows down, manifold pressure goes up. All right, so the same thing's going to happen here. So it's sort of like shifting gears. We'll come back to that when we start talking about props, but remember, that's what these are, and that's what that one does. So at some point, black one starts controlling just the manifold pressure, and the blue one starts controlling just the RPM. It's really not playing along. What's different about this one? No blue knob, so that means what kind of propeller does this have? Fixed pitch, okay. Everything is going slow. All right, so fuel injection. Benefits. Well, maybe before we jump into benefits, we should talk about what fuel injection really is. So far we've been studying carburetors, both pressure and float carburetors. And so they're the same, right? The air comes in, it goes to an air cleaner, it hits the carburetor, whether it be float or pressure carburetor. And at that point, the air is going to go through the carburetor, and it's going to pick up fuel, right? All right, make sure everybody's with me. And then from that point on, right after the carburetor, we have air and fuel goes through the manifold system of the aircraft into the intake valve of the cylinder where we have our 4 strokes. With the fuel injection system that's used on aviation aircraft, what happens is the air comes in through, with the Bendix system, it's going to come through a fuel servo, where it's going to measure out the air, measure out some fuel, and then send the fuel somewhere else. All right, so not right now. It's like, okay, we figured out the air, figured out how much fuel it needs, and let's send that fuel off to the cylinders a different route. So you don't mix the fuel in the air right there going through the intake manifold. So the whole intake manifold is nothing but just air until it gets to the cylinder. Then at the cylinder, there's a little hole drilled right at the cylinder, right before the intake valve, where it squirts it into the cylinder. Now, Continental is going to be completely different. And what it does, it doesn't measure air or anything. It just kind of figures out, well, if the pump is moving this fast, then that means the engine is moving this fast, and that means it must need this much fuel. Therefore, we'll just send that much fuel to the cylinders, and it's kind of like hope we're right, and usually they are. It is the type of fuel injection systems used in automotive these days are timed fuel injection. So it's pretty much done by computers. I think Mercedes was the first one that did it, where it actually pulsed. Maybe it's Porsche, I don't know. But they used mechanical injectors where it would actually time it. You time it like a magneto, and it would pulse the fuel at the right time at every cylinder where it's supposed to go. Then they switched to computer, where the computer would pulse it where it's supposed to go. And now, instead of injecting it in the intake right next to the valve, modern cars inject it right into the cylinders like a diesel would. But of course, you need a lot higher pressures. With aviation, there's no timing. It just squirts it off at the cylinder all of the time. So it's just spraying away there, then the intake valve opens, takes what it needs and closes, and it just keeps spraying right there. So there's no timing to it. The nice part about that is it makes it simple, reliable. The bad part about that is when you're, especially as a mechanic, and you're messing around and you're trying to start these things, if you forget what you're doing and you don't do it correctly, and you're spraying all of this fuel into the airplane, you can set up a condition for a hydraulic lock. And that's exactly what happened to this engine. Somebody called me and said, hey, could you come diagnose this? You know, what happened? And I came and looked, and it was like, wow, I tell you exactly what happened. It's a hydraulic lock. Look how the connecting rod is completely bent, and it blew out the bottom of the skirt here, cracked it all up. So what happened is the intake valve was open. They were running the fuel injection system without the engine running, it's just spraying away, just like a pressure carburetor. If an engine's not running, the mixture is not in idle cutoff, it's anywhere else. It doesn't matter where the throttle is. And the boost pump is running, fuel is going to be spraying at those nozzles. That's just the way it is. And if you leave those nozzles spraying fuel, when the piston comes back and the intake valve opens, it's going to take all of that fuel that's been pouring in and suck it right into the cylinder, close the valves and come up and hit the fuel. There's nowhere else for it to go, and it breaks. Not a big deal, right? And this is only about how much damage?
60.
Probably 30,000. We didn't talk much about this before. You see that stud right there? See how it doesn't actually go through anything? It's called a 7th stud engine, something Continental does on all their newer engines. There's a plate that goes between there and this cylinder over here. So it's just called a 7th stud. Same thing.
What's the benefit of that?
Stronger right there.
Okay.
Yeah. And you can see how the cap is all deformed out. And it put a lot of pressure on that.
I have a question for the pressure carbs.
Wow, going back to pressure carbs. Okay.
Is it similar to automotive's throttle body injection, or
No.
no?
No, because if you think about the throttle body, like Chevrolet's throttle body injection, no, Chevrolet's throttle body injection was like to me, it was like a computer controlled direct injection at the cylinder, but instead they just had one or two spraying right there at the throttle body. So I can see your point. Yeah, I can see why you'd say it's like a pressure carb. It was just computer controlled pressure carb. Yeah, sure, why not? I'll buy that. All right, so what are some of the benefits to fuel injection? Well, no vaporizing. In theory, a uniform delivery of fuel to each cylinder. So instead of one source of fuel coming out at a nozzle being distributed then to 6 cylinders, the air comes through and the air is distributed to all 6 cylinders, and you hope that that's equal. But as it comes through, it goes up to a flow divider, the fuel does, goes to a flow divider and then out to each cylinder. So it's a lot more uniform. Although an interesting side note is that, and I've talked about GAMI before just because I think they do some cool stuff, and almost everybody with a Continental, the first thing, if you have a Continental, and the first thing you want to do to tune it up a little bit is you get GAMI injectors. And what the company GAMI does is they basically take a look, and they've figured out almost every series of engine, the mismatch in flow, because it's not perfect. Because even if you could perfectly match all of the fuel coming out, the air still has to go through the intake system, and that has turns and different runs and can be a little bit different. So they balance all these little injectors exactly to each engine. Juan has GAMIs, right? Improved control over the fuel air mixture. These are not my ideas. So easier maintenance. Well, I could really kind of go on that one. I would say the RSA fuel injection is probably one of the easiest systems in all of aviation to maintain. I'll give them that. It works fantastic until it doesn't. And then when it doesn't, you don't fix it. You send it in to somebody else because it's much like a pressure carburetor with all the little diaphragms and the poppet valves, and you don't want to break that. You don't want to mess with that. Continental is way more robust. There are no diaphragms. Some of them have a diaphragm, but for the most part, you don't deal with diaphragms. But the problem with the maintenance is really difficult because you have to set up the fuel flow, and when it needs adjustment, it can take you on a twin. It can take you all day, if not 2 days, to adjust one. It depends how, because you have to match each engine. So not only do you set up the engine, then set up the other engine, but then once the engines are completely set up, then they need to match. So then you have to fine tune each one within the parameters that you have and adjust the throttle quadrants, because pilots that have nice twins are very picky about when they grab the knobs. They want them to feel like one, and as they advance it, every gauge should do the exact same thing on one engine as done on the other. And if they don't, they're going to bring it back and say, well, you didn't set up my engine correctly. I got to fix those buttons. Better. Acceleration. Characteristics. And increased engine efficiency. It's much easier to properly lean an engine or pull it way back and start running lean of peak if your flows are all the same. Because if you've got a big mismatch between cylinders, and that's one of the problems with carbureted engines, is the big mismatch between them. You get one cylinder goes lean way before the other one goes lean, and so you don't have this balanced engine. So if you can actually balance out the fuel and airflow to every cylinder, then you have much more control over it. Basic design. All right, so what is the basic design here? It uses a continuous flow fuel nozzles located at cylinder intakes. So it uses continuous. Flow. What does continuous flow mean?
It doesn't stop.
Doesn't stop. So what do I mean by this?
It means the injectors are working all the time.
All the time. Injectors do not know what stroke the engine's on. Don't know, don't care. They just flow, they do their thing, and so there's no timing it to the engine. Continuous flow fuel nozzles. If I have a 6-cylinder engine, how many fuel nozzles do I have?
6.
There you go. Located at cylinder intakes. We'll contrast this. Contrast meaning as opposed to some of the things we talked about, timed injection. I believe at one point it was tried in aviation, the timed injection, but it was too much of a problem.
So where directly does the fuel nozzle spray their fuel into?
Intake port on the cylinder.
Okay, and it just fills it, and whenever the engine kind of sucks it in.
That's it.
Okay.
Yeah. When it's ready, it just pulls it in. So basic design, continuous fuel flow as opposed to timed or direct injection, which directs direct into the cylinder, which would also be a type of timed injection.
Does that waste a lot of fuel?
What?
Does that waste fuel?
Not at all. It's perfect. So when the intake valve opens up, it sucks in the air that's there and the fuel that comes there, and it comes in, and it's a nice mixture. So it uses less fuel. I know, it sounds a little crazy, but if we kind of think about, go back to just the carburetor that's always spraying,
Yeah.
it's still doing the same thing. If it should always be spraying, it comes up, we'll do a 4-cylinder. It's going to instantly divide into 4, but only one of them's on intake stroke at any given time. So if we slowed it way down, it'd be pulse, 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 pulse. So it's it's doing the same thing there. It's just a lot more control over this. So yeah, in a perfect world, I suppose you'd find some way to do the direct injection or pulsed injection, but this works fine. All right, Bendix. RSA. So both the Bendix and the Continental systems are similar in that they are continuous fuel flow, have the same benefits. I suppose we could add the benefit that they work upside down, but I don't really see too many fuel injection systems on I take that back. I'm thinking about the, yeah. So like Kristen Eagle is an aerobatic plane. That's got the Bendix RSA system. So yeah, so it works inverted too. Injection. So say it's one of two popular injection systems. What's the other one going to be? Yeah, the Bendix RSA is one popular. What's my second popular? TCMs, the Continentals. So in the field, you're going to see one or the other.
I thought we were going to talk about the RS, not the RSA.
No, we're talking about RSA, not the RS. Yeah, a little. So. All right. Used on Lycoming engines. Isn't that nice? The Continental system you're going to find on Continental systems, and the Bendix RSA you're going to find on the Lycoming systems. You're going to like this. Similar to pressure carbs. I think you're going to take a look at it how it operates if you haven't already, and you're going to go, hey, we just did this last week. It's designed to deliver fuel in relation to the volume of air being consumed. Does this sound familiar so far? Designed to deliver fuel in relation to the volume. Do we want volume, or would we be better off with
Weight.
weight? What's better?
Weight.
Weight, but volume of air being consumed. So in other words, it's going to sense the fuel coming in. I'm sorry, let's try that again. It's going to sense the air coming in and give it the right amount of fuel. Wow, this just sounds like stuff we've already talked about. And how do you suppose they're going to sense the air?
Impact.
I like where you're going with that. What else?
Does it have chambers?
Mm-hmm.
Impact Venturi section.
Impact, air, and Venturi.
Suction.
Suction. Let's talk about our main components. What are the things we're going to be looking at?
So,
Yes.
so the Venturi really is necessary to limit the amount of error. Basically maxing out the amount of error going into the intake, right?
Is the Venturi's job to be the ultimate limiter of air? I would say no. I think that, my opinion, that the purpose of the Venturi is not to limit the air. In fact, I think that's an unwanted byproduct.
Okay.
The purpose of the Venturi is to provide a low pressure to help in measuring the fuel. As where Continental got rid of the Venturi. Okay, we don't want it. And they didn't. Continental takes their Venturi out. So now you don't have a restriction, so you have a better flow through. And so the thing that should be limiting the air should be the throttle valve.
Right, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
I was kind of wondering why do you actually have a Venturi still in there? But then I was thinking, well, maybe.
Same reason you have one in a pressure carb, because it's going to go to chamber A. And you're thinking I said that wrong, but I didn't. Okay, similar. Oops, no, I don't want to write that. Got ahead of myself. Main components. We have the throttle valve. And everybody knows what a throttle valve does. What does that do?
Controls the amount of air going to the engine.
Very good. Controls the amount of air going to the engine. And by controlling the amount of air, we then control the...
Fuel.
Amount of fuel.
amount of fuel, but before that, what does that directly control?
Manifold pressure.
Manifold pressure and thus engine RPM. So fuel servo. The flow divider. Flow divider is where the fuel comes. The fuel servo is kind of the brains of the operation, and the flow divider is actually divides the fuel up.
Do you actually have pictures? Just to,
You want to do pictures now?
well, I want to.
I don't mind. All right. So, let's see. Laser pointer. Our nozzles, servo unit, flow divider. So fuel is going to come into the servo unit, regulated, sent out to the flow divider. From the flow divider, it's going to go to each cylinder. So if this is a 6-cylinder engine, there should be 7 ports. Exactly. One for each cylinder plus a gauge. And a gauge is going to be something special. Going to be if you get it, that's good. If not, you'll be like, I hate that gauge. All right. So here's the flow divider up here. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh, I should have said 8 because gotta have one coming in, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I only see 6 right there. Yeah, I don't think that should be capped. Anyway, so there we are.
They hated the gauge.
I know, hated the gauge. It's got to be one right here. I think we're just not seeing it. So, all right, so flow divider, and then each one of these lines, we're going to talk about these lines. There's an airworthiness directive on all Lycomings up here about how these lines are clamped. So these clamps are specific to an airworthiness directive. So I talk about Adel Clamps in aviation and how everybody hates Adel Clamps. Well, these are really great because there's 2 Adel Clamps for each one of these little setups you have right there.
Why do people hate them so much? Surprise.
No, they're reasonably cheap, but I've showed you they don't line up.
Oh.
So whenever you go to put them together, the holes don't line up for the bolt to go through. And so by the time you get it lined up and take out your tool, they pop back up. So the one hole's here and one hole's here. So they never line up. So they're just no fun that way. Let's see here. What other pictures do I have? There's a blurry picture of one on the side, and there's the impact tubes. 1, 2, 3, 4 impact tubes.
And that's the Bendix, right?
That is the Bendix. And we'll do Continental. Well, Continental.
Because they're in Turing.
There's the Continental system. And notice the Continental system added something else to this. So, just to give you an idea, and we'll go back. What is this called? Flow divider. What do we have down here? Nozzles. What was this called in the other one? You could call it fuel servo, but really, this is now called the throttle body. And there's it's right here. The device that measures out the fuel, or it doesn't measure it, kind of. And then the fuel pump. So in the Continental system, it's got a very, very unique fuel pump that only works with this system. And it's very interesting. I think it's cool. All right, back to this. All right, so flow divider, injector nozzles, and fuel pump. Even though the RSA system doesn't have a special fuel pump, still needs a fuel pump. And for most Lycomings, that is the diaphragm pump. Let's see. Before we write it, let's take a look at it. Go to simplified version. laser pointer. All right. Everything looks about the same as before, doesn't it? We have chamber, we can say A, B, C, and D. Gotta be backwards. A, B, C, D. And I believe all of the pressure carb drawings, I think they were all drawn from left to right. A, B, C, D, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, they were.
Yep, A, B, C, D from left to right, A, B, C, D from left to right. Well, we don't really get necessarily into this A, B, C, D, but if we were, then this would be, well, if we kept the same convention, A, B, C, D, we could do that. But let's take a look at what we have going on. What is chamber A in a pressure carburetor? Impact air. All right, so let's see here. Let's do impact air in a blue.
Shouldn't be C and D the opposite because down there
I'm
under
showing you.
fuel. Okay.
So I said if we kept the same convention as we did before, then we would go A, B, C, D, right? If we kept the same convention, but I said, now let me show you where we're going with this. So is it? Well, before, these two were backwards. So now this becomes impact air. Venturi suction is over this way. But I bet you guys can figure out exactly what it's going to do because it really doesn't change. Maybe yellow isn't the best choice. All right. So as we open the throttle, air flows through here. We know we're going to have impact air. And we know as the air flows faster, we're going to have Venturi suction. So Venturi suction is acting in, we know Venturi suction is acting here, and we know that impact air is coming in here, and we know from what we've already learned that what should we expect to see happen? Just think pressure carbs. What should happen when Venturi suction increases and impact air?
Air metering force increases.
Air metering force increases, which means what happens to the poppet?
Opens.
Hey, let's just apply it. Does that hold true? Okay. This becomes suction. It pulls this way. This becomes impact, goes to the right. So both of these are forcing it to the right. Here's a little poppet valve. And what happens when the poppet valve goes to the right? Opens more. So more fuel goes to out to the flow divider. Cool. That worked. Okay. Now let's take a look. So everything's the same. It's just A and B are swapped and move to the other side. So instead of A, then B, impact, then suction, it goes suction, then impact, but who cares, right? Yeah.
Do you have to have a bleed between A and B?
Only if you want what?
The mixture control?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, they don't need one,
Uh-huh.
but simplified version here. By the way, notice this is Continental Motors down here. Don't let that fool you. This is Bendix RSA. This is not the Continental system. All right, so let's take a look here. Let's go red. All right, so we have from the boost pump going to the fuel pump. So we've got, what do we call this right here?
Unmetered
Fuel output.
Fuel pump output. So that would be like chamber E. Okay, I like that. So that's like chamber E. Nobody said it is, though. And then it's going to get here, and it's got two ways to go. And notice that it is really unhindered to come in here. So what do you want to kind of call that?
D.
Unmetered fuel? I know, it's kind of like D, really, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It sort of is. That's just the way it is, right? I mean, what happened to E? I don't know. It's just kind of make it up here, and then D becomes here. Again, they don't have A, B, C, D, but we're just making it up, making it work for what we know. And then, well, why not orange? All right. So then we go through, what is this little thing right here? Ah, look at you guys. Main metering jet into this chamber here. All right. So let's think about what happens. I increase the throttle. As I increase the throttle, the poppet valve is going to move to the right. We know that everything over the fuel metering force has to balance stuff out. So we just have to think about, well, how's this balancing out? So with fuel metering force wanting to go to the right, this right here, the unmetered fuel is my heavy pressure this time, trying to close it, right? So again, it's just on a different side. So it's over here trying to close it. And what is metered fuel really doing for me? Is it trying to open it or close it?
Trying to open it a
Kind of
little bit.
open it.
It's pushing it to the right, isn't it? So we have Venturi suction, impact, and in a way,
Less-
metered fuel trying to push it. Just, for sake of conversation here. But, so what's happening is, okay, so let's open the throttle. Open the throttle. This increases. Let me back up. Everything's in balance, all right? We're operating, we're cruise, we're happy. Let's open the throttle. Open the throttle, I get more air metering force, A and B, so the poppet's going to open. When the poppet opens, it's going to flow out of here. So what happens to the pressure here as this poppet opened and let more fuel flow? It drops, right? So if this pressure decreases, then what happens is this pushes it back a little bit, back into equilibrium. All right, so why did this decrease? Because I opened the drain right here. So right there is the little drain, if you want to call it that. Probably shouldn't, but we will. So when the air metering force increases, it causes the poppet go to the right, opening this up right here, draining fuel out of here. Because remember, there's a little orifice here, and it really doesn't let it all come flooding in anyway. So because there's an orifice here, this pressure's less than over here. So this is already less, and it's already restricted. Then I open the drain, it's going to drain right out. So if it drains right out, then this pressure drops. If this pressure drops, it no longer helps the air metering force. And so we have right here the unmetered fuel, right here, is a greater pressure and exerts a force that balances it. All right, so I close the throttle. Not all the way, but I close it some. I'm going to lose the air metering force. And so that tends to want to let the poppet valve go back the other way. And as it goes the other way, it is going to close this off, which increases the force here, which helps to balance the high pressure of the unmetered fuel. Everybody follow me on that one?
Mhm.
All right, so it's the same thing as the pressure carb, but just switched up a little tiny bit.
Is that unmetered fuel, is it constant? Like sea level?
Pretty much, yeah. Pretty much.
I was just
For
gonna
now.
ask if the metered fuel is the same, it remains the same pressure, or if it varies slightly.
Varies a lot.
Okay.
All right. So in this case, we don't really have this pressure relief valve in here saying, hey, you got to stay at this pressure. Doesn't happen in this one. It allows for fluctuations. In fact, we'll take a break and then we'll add a little complexity to this.